Maximizing layer performance, or in the other spirit of the season, high path avian influenza, the other March Madness. And so, what we're going to be going over today is some review of current trends in high path avian influenza, some practical management strategies, and also how it affects market dynamics that we can ultimately review on the producer level. My name is Tim Broderick. I head up our poultry team as our R&D technical director. Our poultry team also comprises of Aaliyah Gelati, who's a product specialist we have in Tennessee, Jeremy Cordova down in Ecuador, and our newest addition, PhD, Dr. Sydney Tuckweiler. However, unfortunately, you guys are stuck with me as the sole representative for this presentation this morning. So what we're going to start out with is a review of the current state of high path avian influenza and kind of how we got here. So when we look at high path, it started in 2021, even though the first US cases weren't until 2022, but we started seeing some movement within regular surveillance of migratory birds and seeing some propagation of that Eurasian strain in Canada. And that really spurred the outbreak in 2022, where we saw a little over 57 million birds depopulated. And initially in 2023, it looked like the tapering out, like we've seen with past high path breaks in 2015-16, where it was only a couple year period. We saw that number decrease by over half. However, we started seeing the underlying signs of a long-standing threat, and that was really driven through detections in wild bird populations, as well as increased detections of high path in mammalian species upper in the food chain, and then also into the early part of 2024, where we started seeing detections in dairy cattle, which represented a fairly significant shift in high path control and surveillance. And that really kind of spurred your 2024 5 into now, where we've seen in excess of 50 million birds depopulated, and something that we're well on our way to hit that number again this year. Along the way, there's been some things that have really started to trigger public awareness in addition to government responses. We're going to cover those a little bit more in depth, but the increase in egg prices in the early part of 2025 really started driving some diversified policy efforts in DC, and kind of has led to the approval and administration of additional research funds and efforts that go on today. And so, as I mentioned, this is a continued and elevated strain on the commercial poultry industry. When we look at the 2022 outbreak of over 57 million birds, at first in 23, we hoped that this was kind of a petering out of that viral challenge, but we've seen a fairly elevated and consistent number of birds affected in the last couple of years. And when we start looking at the actual dynamics of how those challenges occur in terms of time of year and where we are today, we're really right on pace to meet our 2025 depopulation numbers, if not exceed them. The challenge with that is obviously it's an immense strain on industry when we're looking at the removal of over 50 million birds from the production system every year. However, it's also a more predictable number, which is at least some benefit when we talk about market and adaptations we've made within that space. When we start looking at the risk, most producers and emphasis is put on periods of migration, seeing the highest amount of caseloads. But when we start looking at bird numbers over the last 4 or 5 years, we really don't see necessarily a spike, especially with spring migration, like we do see in the fall. Our one period of reprieve generally is June, July, and August. We know that the virus does have challenge with staying active in hotter temperatures that we see during the summer periods. And that's also paired with the fact that birds are a little bit more stagnant in terms of migratory and reproductive behaviors during that time period. So we do with fall migration see a reintroduction kind of from north down to south with those birds. However, with a lot of birds overwintering still within the United States, we do see a sustained and elevated challenge November, December, and then into the spring without really an elevated spring peak in terms of excess challenge during that migratory period. The other thing is, unfortunately, it's not just dependent on these migratory birds moving. We've seen recent outbreaks over the past couple weeks in Michigan, South Dakota, significant ones in Pennsylvania. And so, even though we're not in the peak migratory seasons yet for those states, we're still seeing them contribute over 7 million birds to the total number of outbreak in just the past month. And so, when we start looking at those migratory bird trends, and those flyways are along the Mississippi and Mississippi Delta, as long as some activity on the East Coast and West Coast flyways. Migration really hasn't started. Cornell Lab has a really good software called Birdcast that kind of tracks the presence and routes of some of these migratory birds, which we do see extending up into the Midwest, in the Dakotas, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois, as long as a bigger population is moving from Texas. But we're really not going to see that peak until about mid-April in the South, and then eventually crescendo up into the northern parts of the United States by mid-May. It's still something as a great tool for people to utilize just to understand where these migratory birds are coming from and where that potential elevated risk can appear. When we start looking at government responses over the past 5 years, it's really picked up within the last year. Again, partially driven by that now consumer facing uh, challenge in terms of egg prices. And there's different responses from the government, both at the federal and individual state levels. USDA last year came out with their $1 billion plan to fight avian flu and lower egg prices. And it really consists of five core components: looking at biosecurity, speeding of repopulation, cutting of red tape, innovate in the adaptation of protective measures, as well as adjustments of trade. In my mind, there's really two that are going to be primary drivers towards our success in alleviating the strain of high path. That's going to be some of the biosecurity assessments with $500 million investment into audits and cost share programs to enhance biosecurity on farms, as well as the innovate protection area with $100 million that we're going to talk about in the subsequent slide, looking at research strategies to reduce that risk of high path, improve repopulation efforts, or build immunity. When we look at some of the others, some are just simply more effective than others at actually achieving our target to fight avian flu or lower egg prices. We saw some adjustments in trade, and we'll cover that when we look at some of the economic data. But adding trade into the United States from foreign countries for egg supply just isn't as economical as other products. And it's a fairly nominal amount when you consider the total US production. So it really just doesn't move the needle that much for me. When we look at regulatory red tape, as much as all producers are in favor of cutting out as much red tape as possible, especially in the realm of government oversight, it just doesn't, again, necessarily move the needle. We're looking at easing rules for homegrown chickens or smaller scale producers. And when you add up that total egg output or production output on the meat bird side as well, it just, again, doesn't really move the needle in terms of the millions of birds that are affected every month. Similarly, with speeding of repopulation, that focuses more on the indemnity side, which is very valuable to any producer who's gone through the horrific day of identifying a high path challenge and then having to deal with an extended cleanup period, repopulation, a lot of government red tape, and emotional and financial burden. Higher indemnity rates help, but do they really speed up repopulation? In my mind, not necessarily, because the indemnity simply isn't the main hurdle when we talk about repopulating flocks or getting barns back to where they can house birds again. There are state-based applications as well. Minnesota has a great dashboard tracking high path cases throughout the state, both in the short and longer term, what types of industries and flocks are affected, and more importantly, where those cases end up lying. Additionally, you see state programs. There's some that have been introduced to enhance the biosecurity measures within different states. And USDA, again, kind of focusing on wildlife biosecurity assessments, biosecurity compliance audits, and some cost share associated with biosecurity practices. The USDA research response is one of the newer things that's really going to drive how we as an industry respond in the future to these types of challenges. So we have $100 million that's allocated for USDA and APHIS investment for high path control. And some of their stated objectives really focus on vaccine development, therapeutics, and different research strategies. Some of the ones highlighted below are ones that I think are really going to be able to affect how this condition is managed or reduced and can actually drive some return for producers. So that's research looking at prevention of barn-to-barn spread in high-path avian influenza positive premises. Again, kind of going back to biosecurity and making sure that we can mitigate that spread site to site, although it's fairly small compared to introduction from wild birds or outside vectors. Reducing return to business timelines is really a critical one. So how fast can we get these barns back, but without any type of additional risk of that vaccine staying in the, or that virus staying in the environment? Mapping immune responses to high path avian influenza might not be the most exciting sounding, but when we talk about long-term strategies to enhance immune responses, especially if we move towards vaccine rollout in the near future, those types of underlying research projects are going to be very important. And then there's multiple projects focused on different H5N1 or other high path strains relative to vaccine development. There are some vaccines on the market. However, their application and use in the US is going to be a fairly big industry shift should we decide to go that route. So when we look at actual management strategies at the producer level for high path, we have biosecurity. The chart on the right really highlights what are the primary methods to decrease high path avian influenza risk, biosecurity and biosecurity. And I know for the last 4 years, it's like us out there beating a dead horse. But at the end of the day, when you have a terminal condition such as high path, where one positive bird yields condemnation of the premises, we end up having a very skewed view in terms of prevention measures. We can't save the flock, so the only method that we truly have is mitigation through biosecurity. However, within the biosecurity program, and it's something that all producers have in place, there's a couple areas that I want to draw a little bit more targeted focus on just in conversations that we've had with producers, things that we've been seeing on the market, and other adaptations. So when we look at wildlife vectors, according to USDA, and I haven't seen the underlying data to confirm, but they've said that 83% of high path infections are from wild bird transmission. So obviously it means that we have a significant single vector that's driving these high path introductions into our farm sites. Now, how that actually gets from the bird to our commercial flocks, whether it's then through humans, environment, other interactions, is still a little bit unknown. Largely, we see sparrows and starlings can be affected, but are rarely introducing the virus. On the dairy side, we've seen some higher die-offs with sparrows and starlings during some of those high path breaks, but usually it's migratory waterfowl. And we've seen more technological solutions become available. Sound machines have been there for a long time. Other people have used different methods to try and reduce bird populations within the farm site. However, whenever we have kind of a lot of grains and open space, we're inherently having a lot of bird movement throughout that site. So we've seen a little bit more adoption of laser technologies on barns, especially here within some of the turkey barns in Minnesota. And it's also a good time to review other wildlife vectors. As much as we focus on biosecurity as it relates to high path avian influenza, there's a lot of other diseases that can be mitigated through an effective biosecurity program. So don't just focus on wild birds. Take the time to audit for rodent control, other diseases, as well as insect control within the farm site and premise. Personnel management is something that really has come up, especially with the outbreak on the dairy side within some of that Texas. And it also highlights some of the human nature that biosecurity programs have to interact with. So when we look at biosecurity, we have to make them easy and intuitive to follow. They should also be routinely audited, understand employee pain points so that they can be mitigated because we have to make it intuitive. I've described it before as a good biosecurity program being the wall or fence around your house. It keeps most things out, but it's not foolproof. A great biosecurity program is your house itself. That's what's giving you the ultimate protection, but it's also what's creating value for you. Your property value isn't necessarily going up because of your fence, it's going up because you have a good house. And occasionally that house has to be repainted or you need a new roof. And that's what we see with a great biosecurity program is the continued updates and additions and tweaks to that program to make it as good as it can be. Also, it has to really interact with that human nature. So, when we start looking at human responses to challenges and stresses within the job of maintaining barns, responding to alarms, we need that default to be following the program. You can have a great program on paper that simply isn't followed. We have one that I saw that I think is a really good example is a foot bath with kind of a Dutch entry behind it, creating a physical barrier. And the reason that's a good example is you have a foot bath that could just be stepped over, but instead you have a barrier behind it that kind of can't. So unless you have a NFL combine type vertical jump or broad jump, you're not going to be able to clear both of those hurdles. And it forces you upon entry into that farm site or into that barn to actually use the foot bath. Because the first thing an employee often has, if they're responding to alarms, especially or more urgent situations, is to run into that barn or run into that control room. And anything that's not intuitive to do in terms of your biosecurity program simply won't. The other big thing is understanding the home risk for employees. Oftentimes, we think of biosecurity programs as kind of stopping at the entrance to the farm. Communication is something we're going to talk about a little bit later, but when we understand that, especially for certain communities or migrant workers, we end up seeing multiple farm sites that employ either the same people or people within the same households. And so if you have a husband who works at the dairy farm and a wife who works at the poultry farm, we now have a commingling of those two worlds. And anything we can do to provide these employees, even at home, to help understand and mitigate any type of mix between whether it's footwear, clothing, etc., is going to be really important to understanding the risk to your own operation. Vehicles are one of the biggest things that I see with communication of your plan. So we all, for the most part, have awareness of our own plans. A lot of people are very good about communicating and auditing those plans with their employees. But there's other people that visit the farm site, whether it's a grain elevator, feed delivery, whether it's techs or other technical service, veterinarians, etc. And a lot of these people in their own space have a good understanding of biosecurity programs and best practices, but it's still important to communicate your expectations and needs as a producer to them. And so we want to avoid any unnecessary traffic onto a farm site. If you can, utilize tire washes, tire pits, or full vehicle cleaning stations, but also try and minimize routes through control zones or wetland crossings. I was speaking to a mill in Iowa, and one of the frustrations that they expressed was Iowa doesn't do as good of a job posting their control zones. And so their concern to me and kind of asking for feedback was, how do I know if I'm driving my feed truck next to a dairy that has a break or next to a poultry operation that just broke, and then taking that and driving right onto someone else's poultry farm and inadvertently creating some type of condition that could exacerbate spread. The tough thing is you don't. If you have a state that has good surveillance programs and good data, then it's something you can definitely work around, and I encourage people to. If not, then following and maximizing the rest of your protocols are going to give you the best advantage. I actually added wetland crossings to that list of control zones because there's other areas, especially started getting into the spring and summer, where we see a lot of waterfowl crossing from one lake to another that's on the side of the highway. And you'll see that just manure or poop that's on the road and can easily get picked up into tires. So anything we can do if we know that there's areas of increased risk to at least acknowledge and then mitigate that risk is going to help us in the future. So before we start getting into some of the solutions, we're really going to focus on the downstream market impacts when we talk about high path avian influenza outbreaks. So first is layers have proportionally the greatest loss, and that's why kind of the next couple slides on the market side, as well as a lot of these interventions are actually going to be geared towards responses in the layer industry. Broiler breeders talk about a 0.5% of annualized production, broilers 0.04%. So the broiler industry just doesn't have that same consistent challenge. Layers and turkey breeders have it the worst. When you talk about outbreak numbers, about 10% of the commercial lay flock in a year-to-year basis is being depopulated because of high path influenza, and it's the highest total number, representing 148 million birds in the layer pullet space alone. Turkey breeders, again, as a proportion of turkey breeder flock, is fairly high, and then turkeys have also had a rough go at it with about 2.5% of domestic capacity attributed to cumulative loss year over year. When we start looking at table egg production and egg production metrics in general, going back to 2024, we do see those changes in layer inventory. So late 24, early 25, when we saw that significant decline in layer flock numbers with some significant high path breaks, we see that reduction in lay inventory. Obviously, that then corresponds to a significant decrease in monthly table egg production. And once we start seeing those decreases, it's a fair depression for the next 6 months or so as we start repopulating those flocks. But it is a prolonged strain on our inventory numbers. And we start seeing that compared to last or prior outbreaks as a reflection of egg price. When we start looking at the actual market for table eggs, it is a fairly quick market. Eggs are within a week on supermarket shelves. Liquid products have a little bit more shelf life, but we don't see the cold storage numbers that we would with a pork or beef market. Because of that, we have some more rapid responses when we start seeing a decline in the total flock. And with a domestic flock size of give or take 330 million birds, we end up seeing with certain houses or certain complexes being depopulated upwards of 1% of daily production offline within a 24-hour period. And then that persists over a multiple month period. So when we start looking at our time points within high path breaks in 2015, we did see a reduction in table egg production due to some significant depopulations, and that corresponded to the blue lines, which are egg prices in kind of the annual dollars or scaled for inflation. And we see a repeated effect during our most recent outbreak with some of those depressions within table egg production in the middle part of 2022 and into the early part of 2024. And those really drove up your egg prices within that area going into 2025. That has since come down. However, we've also seen some breaks within the last month that could again start that trend back up. Replacement pullet inventory has been increasing in response to this continued repopulation of layers. So when we look at replacement pullet inventory going back to 22, so right before we really started seeing any type of high path losses, we had that population at about 125 million pullets. That's now gone up to fairly sustained around 140. And we've seen some additional pullet operations be brought online. And so that's really kind of in response to those high path losses and turnover. Now, that said, we still see those high path losses outpace at times that turnover. So when we start looking at those key points of December, January, February of 2024 into 2025, we see those black lines representing high path losses in table eggs for each month exceed 10, 15, and almost 20 million birds month over month. And so that is what's going to really spur us to be significantly above our replacement levels. And that's reflective of those blue bars. So change in the month in table egg layer inventory. When we have those low high path losses, we're able to make a net increase of birds on the ground. And we see that in 2025 in the summer, with June, July, August having those positive blue lines. But again, when we start losing 10 million layers a month, we simply can't have the pullets on the ground to make a quick replacement. And that's where we start seeing price and population start moving in parallel. We've fitted some averages here to just kind of highlight some 5-month bird number averages in green and 2-month price averages in blue. And the reason there's a 3-month separation there is because we have that lag relative to the response that we're able to put back into that marketplace. So we kind of just graphed commercial layer condemnations on a month per month basis to changes in egg price. And what we end up seeing is some of those significant spikes in egg price are not just immediately due to the depopulation effort, but they actually can have an extended moving average compared to those bird numbers simply because it's not an immediate replacement. We have to wait for those pullets to be placed. We need to wait for those pullets to then reach sexual maturity, light stimulation, and then even once they're in production, we need them to ramp up to peak. So we end up being about a half year behind that day-to-day replacement. As I mentioned before, one of the government responses when we start looking at the actual egg numbers is to increase imports. That was one of the focuses in 2025, where we saw a significant increase in million dozen equivalents compared to any prior year, almost 100 million additional dozen equivalents. However, it's just, again, doesn't really move the needle when we look at domestic production. So it got a lot of attention that we were getting eggs from Turkey or other countries imported into the US. But when we look at the true market impact, it's fairly minimal. Additionally, our export market went down because we had lowered domestic production in 2025. There is a forecast for that to return to about 250 million dozen equivalents in 2026. So what's the market implications? We say all that to say this. Increased pullet value due to diminished pullet supply. Even though we're placing more birds, we still have a diminished end supply of layers. So that increases pullet value and makes a pretty tight pullet market. So with producers that have difficulty securing pullets in the open market and greater pressures on pullet growers to maintain livability and performance of that flock. On the table egg side, we see potential for increased table egg value, but this is specific to certain situations. Contracts can mitigate certain producer benefits. If they're locked into a price, open market pricing simply doesn't have the same efficacy in terms of their total profitability. However, producers without contracts do see significant increases in profitability, or some with some section of their market being open market. Additionally, we've seen a lot more producers that have scalers built into their contracts at certain price thresholds. So their price may not change immediately, but if we see a significant spike within that open market egg price, we have seen more contracts where producers can get an extra 5 cents or 10 cents per dozen as a share of that market increase. We've also seen some greater market entrance total. So, slightly indicated by that increased total pullet number, we've seen some pressure on the liquid egg market at times due to increased overall supply. So, just more people bringing in spent hens and trying to bring them back into production, as well as more people with seeing higher egg prices trying to get into an open market situation, has led for some of their byproduct or lower graded eggs ending up into the liquid market. So the few producers that are really in a liquid market have actually seen some pressure that's driving liquid prices down at times. So at the grower level, knowing that, what are our focuses? Knowing we have increased pullet value and diminished supply, longer wait times yield extensions of the life cycle. We've seen people taking birds out longer because it's more profitable to have a barn in production, especially if you have adequate late production, than have it sit empty. Additionally, pullet health and performance are really at a premium. If you can get good pullets, the supply for those coming into lay is definitely going to be there as well as the demand. And we have potential for increased that table egg value. So again, producers without contracts, especially when prices are high, eggs per hen housed are going to drive that value, which means it has to be a combination of production and livability for that house. And maximizing livability, maintaining that high production, really regardless of feeder additive cost, is going to end up still being the more profitable approach for those flocks. Additionally, we've seen more people bring in molted flocks or spent hen production. And those molted flocks or new barns that are bringing in fresh birds, but they're starting at 80 weeks for one cycle hens are going to try and recapture value. But there's some challenges within those types of operations. We've seen multiple producers that are populating a 50 or 100,000 bird house with hens that are coming from three different operations, two different breeds, and three different ages. And that becomes really tough to manage, both in terms of health, because you're now mixing multiple flocks into one, as well as nutrition, because you're trying to feed three different overlaid curves into one. So when we look at optimizing those production periods, whenever we're in lay on the pullet stage, we want to really optimize for uniformity, livability, and gain. We need a uniform flock because that's going to help us come into production efficiently and effectively. We need livability so we can get those birds into the lay barn. And ultimately, we're trying to hit our growth targets. So we need to achieve gain. As we come into production, shell quality, egg quality are all going to operate on these curves. And so when we see what can we actually influence in the pullet side, especially with health programs, we have the ability to influence a lot of that. Pullets are kind of a lot about optimizing for health and optimizing for management. The layer side, you're kind of guiding that flock along. So when we talk about opportunities, if we have a flock that's peaking effectively and you're at 97.5%, there's not a whole lot of additives or management you can do to get to 98.5 or 99. If anyone can show me a chicken that we can squeeze 2 eggs out of a day, please let me know. We have a great business opportunity for you. But until then, we're capped at the genetic potential of those birds. And so we don't see the return when there's just simply the ceiling that we're running up against. Now, that said, that's why late lay is one of the bigger focuses for us, both post molt and into later single stage production. Because as those numbers start to come down, we also see just the cumulative wear and tear on those birds being in production for over a year straight to start having health challenges, both metabolically and through diseases. And anything we can do there, we actually have a room to bring up production by 2 or 3% or reduce mortality by a couple percent and yield very positive economic returns to producers. So, what do some of those health programs and support look like? When we talk about pullets specifically, uniformity is really one of our key benchmarks there. And I'm really just showing this data to underscore why we feel uniformity is so important. This was actually done in breeder quail, so we brought them through production periods, both in the pullet and lay stage. And when we started looking at the application of, in this case, Prosper as a product that was being tested, we saw improvements in body weight, but more importantly, we saw improvements in uniformity or a reduction in variation. The reason this is important is when we're able to reduce variation in any type of flock, we're only giving those flocks one diet. So when we start bringing them into lay, we are now able to feed a more precise flock and really maximize our nutritional program. So when we brought this flock into lay, we saw an increase in lay percent, 5 additional eggs over 10 weeks, especially for them coming into production in those first 10. But it's not the lay numbers that really draws my attention because there's things that can affect different lay characteristics as flocks come into production. But it's, again, that standard deviation or variation. With a more uniform flock coming into production, we saw a reduction in that variation coming into lay. And that is really what's going to be driving our benefit coming into a early lay and peak lay scenario. So how do we actually go about improving uniformity, reducing variation? In pullets, there's a lot of challenges, especially in non-conventional operations where we have pullets raised on the floor. But we also have a significant challenge that we're giving those pullets ourselves, and that's through vaccination programs that are fairly intensive. And we looked at Actifide, one of our prebiotic compounds, at 1 pound per ton, 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after a vaccination period. And what we ended up seeing was a significant improvement in antibody titer responses. So we're actually seeing an increase in immune reaction from those vaccines that we want to support that response and immune response so that if they're subjected to that challenge later in life, they have those natural soldiers to go fight that battle. But we also saw a reduction in the variation. So we saw a more uniform response. So it wasn't necessarily that every bird had higher titers, it's that every bird had more similar titers to the bird next to it. And that really helps bring that flock together. If they're all undergoing the same stresses in the same way, then they can all respond fairly evenly. And when we start looking at a product for us like Nutrifibe, which includes that Actifide prebiotic, that's where we start seeing improvements in body weight and uniformity. In pullets, it's not just about gut health or 7-day mortality or 14-day mortality. It's about all the stresses that we put on that flock throughout a 16 or 17 week period. So when we looked at a field trial with Nutrifibe compared to an untreated control, we saw slight improvements in feed efficiency, but more importantly, greater body weights and greater uniformity. And that really goes into what's in that product. So we look at a prebiotic blend, has Actifide, which we showed has some of that more immunomodulation that can improve tighter uniformity. It has Integramos, which can help bind certain pathogens and improve gut health, and Yucca shidegra, which can also help in gastrointestinal tract ammonia binding, antioxidant properties, etc. And so it's taking a cumulative effect of a bunch of different prebiotic fibers that can help with those different smaller challenges throughout the production period for those pullets. Now, when we start going into late production, again, that's an area that we feel has opportunities for producers, primarily because as we're starting to see production lessen, our feed efficiency gets a little bit worse. Those birds are a little bit older, metabolic stresses, environmental stresses just start catching up. And so we've seen producers with some challenges in late livability and just late production. And so our primary usage protocols involve Prosper EO, where in commercial lay flocks of over 100,000 birds, we've seen that change in mortality during the application period. So here, Prosper in green versus a control barn in yellow, we just start seeing a separation after about 10 weeks of administration. In this case, where the cumulative mortality during that period starts to just gradually increase in the control and separate from those receiving Prosperio in the feed. Additionally, feed efficiency in those flocks was significantly improved in terms of pounds per dozen of eggs produced. And when we start looking at those numbers, it's about a 1.22% improvement in mortality, generated an additional 1,100 hens in that barn. But even with those higher bird numbers and bird preservation, we saw 60 fewer tons of feed consumed during the trial period and 19 fewer cases produced. The pretrial difference between those two houses was 251 cases, and so that was slightly mitigated down to a 19 case depression. But we've seen it before with other continued data. We got a 6-week trial that we just got some data back where we saw an improvement in those 6 weeks of about 0.3% livability and mitigated production decline. In this case, where we have two houses compared to their historic control, both houses receiving Prosper EO, we see a net change in livability of 2.1 and 2.43%. And these are houses that were stocked with about 288,000 birds each. And so in the first 8 weeks, compared to historic averages and trends of a 5-house average, we really didn't see much differentiation. But as those birds got later into lay, again, those small challenges started to build up. We started to see that the value in those mitigation programs. And within those 30 weeks of lay, we saw in those houses about an additional 30,000 dozen eggs produced. So why do we end up using Prosper within some of these applications? For us, it's really about those smaller challenges that are occurring throughout the production cycle, especially when we're taking birds and extending them because of those opportunities with high path avian influenza. So Prosper gives us 3 different oils within that blend, as well as our Actify prebiotic, and it allows us to overcome multiple differential low-level challenges. If you have any questions on either of those products, feel free to contact me or any of your Ralco representatives. We'd be more than happy to go into more specific usage applications for your individual operation. So really, what are the key takeaways? If you learn nothing else today, here's one thing. High path is on track right now to be as severe as it was in 2024, 2025. And we really see June, July, and August being the only reprieve. It's not an increase with migration. It's really a sustained high level of high path challenge throughout the US. And it's going to vary a little bit where we see some more cases break in the South and then in the North. But we do have, even now, a significant high path pressure in Pennsylvania, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Michigan. Vaccination and treatment options are being seriously evaluated by USDA, and that's going to be really a focus both on economic policy, regulatory policy, and then ultimately the ability to roll out those vaccines. Layer market is disproportionately affected. The only one that's really close is the turkey breeder market. And then turkeys have also been having a tough time. But the most forward-facing for consumers outside of some different price pressures around Thanksgiving is definitely going to be the layer market. And that's why it's gotten so much attention, but also has some opportunities. High path exacerbates any type of shortage in the pullet market, even though we've seen some strong pullet numbers, just because we have to keep catching up to these high path depopulations. Pullet quality is at a premium. The better quality pullets we can get, the more uniform pullets we can get, the better production we're going to get out of that flock. And right now, whenever egg prices fluctuate and have the ability to go high, that becomes more and more important. Additionally, that increased lead time has led to keeping older flocks in production. Newer barns, instead of getting a contract for pullets, are now waiting a year for that contract to start and are instead filling that gap year with older birds. And that's creating a little bit of a different market pressure, but also different challenges within those operations. Additionally, high path losses yield depressed egg supply. So we know the laws of supply and demand, and that just increases value and contract incentives in some producers. It is important to note that other producers, if you have a set contract, simply see no change with it and are only under the excess biosecurity pressure and environmental stress and pressure that high path challenges can yield. Late lay offers, in my opinion, one of the greatest opportunities to improve production. And this is really irregardless of a high path challenge, but in today's market conditions, it just makes it that much more important to get good hen house numbers. When we have a good health in our flock and adequate peaking numbers, we just don't have a lot of opportunity to further improve them. The back end is where we can really see improvements in livability and improvements in egg production. And when you start looking at the total hen-housed egg production numbers for a flock, that's where you can really make up significant ground. So with that, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or contact myself or any other member of our poultry team at a later date. There is one question regarding vaccine implementation and when we think that we would actually see a vaccine. It's a tough one to speculate on when we start looking at vaccine implementation. Again, it's really a multifaceted issue. If it was just when is there a vaccine that we feel is available, then vaccine rollout would be tomorrow. However, there's significant trade pressures and trade implications relative to vaccine administration. And there's also some disagreement based on the industries that would affect. So we see the broiler market being the primary export market, but as we shared earlier, they're really not that affected by high path challenge. And so the layer market is mostly affected, but it has fairly nominal exports within that industry. And so there are some protocols being explored to where turkeys and layers could potentially utilize vaccines and broilers not have to in order to kind of preserve some of those market and trade relationships. I'd say the earliest would be maybe late 2027. There's a lot of kind of regulatory hurdles to get through on the USDA side and then just broad spectrum acceptance. The current administration has a fairly challenging um, relationship with vaccines at the moment. And so introduction of that is still on the USDA priorities, but would be a little bit of a challenge in Washington as well. But it is something that is, again, being seriously considered. All right. So again, if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out. I hope this was of value and you have a great rest of your Thursday. Thank you.